Okay, we've got everybody rolling in here. Let's go ahead and get going with this. Shift gears a little bit. Your tests I do not have today. They will be back with you Monday. I'm almost done with them still. I'm still dealing with some illness issues with my daughter and things, which is unfortunately kind of slowed me down a little bit, but I'll get those things back to you with plenty of time before test 3, which is really when you need them back by, in case you're planning on, adapting anything or making any changes. But I think most people are pretty much good to go. I think most people are really doing exactly what needs to be done. So, there's no reason for people to be stressing out about getting those back. I do want to shift away from maritime stuff. For the last 2 times we were talking about ships and nautical things, and we kind of went right up into the modern world last time. I got done with like 2 minutes to spare, so that's always good. I want to shift a little bit, and we're going to talk now. We're going to step back into the human past, and we're going to be talking more about land-based warfare, weapons, and how these came about, and what difference any of this stuff made. What were the consequences? So I'm going all the way from really the first weapons today, so we can really talk about. And I'm going to go right up to the edge of what we call the early modern era. So that's like the 13 and 1400s AD. So we've got a lot of chronological ground to cover today, but I think you'll find that the lecture itself is probably certainly no longer than the things dealing with maritime tech. One thing that I want to say, like just straight up, as directly as I can, and I think you'll see this to be the case over the next couple weeks in the class. When we think about military technology, whether it's on land or at sea or in the air, military technology and war itself can be seen as the most consistent driver of human technology. It's the most consistent driver of human technology. And I want to talk about why that's so. And I want you to think of it this way. You don't have to agree with that. You can certainly say, well, no, it's not. There are other things that drive technology. But the most consistent driver, why would war be such a consistent driver or advancement in terms of human technology? We can point to several things. You could say that war is an environment in which the consequences of failure are personal and immediate. If you are a war fighter, whether in the modern world or way, way back in ancient human past, and your technology fails you because somebody else has a better weapon or a better armor or a better whatever, that consequence to you is immediate. It's not like you have a lot of leeway there. It's not like you say, well, time out, let's go back and rethink this and reimagine, re-engineer. And no, you've got to get it right. You've got to get it right, because if you don't, there's a potentially high price to pay, and for you immediately. Not just for people far away, maybe. It might be for you personally having to bear the consequence of a failed technology. So human nature being what it is, war, really you might say war is the great universal of human culture. Human societies from ancient times have always practiced warfare. Now they practiced it maybe in different ways, some of them more direct and total than others, but there is no culture or society on the planet which does not practice, has not been impacted by war and conflict. So war then, we could say, is the most consistent driver of technology. Now I want to point out a couple things to you from the book, and this is probably the last time I'll do this here. When we've talked in this class so far, I want you to just think back to like that very first class day, maybe the second class day, when we were talking about technology and was it good or bad. And you guys were a really interesting class, because almost nobody that I remember in this class said technology is good or it's bad, which was good, right? It was a good thing, because all of you, even in that early stage in the class, you were nuanced enough to understand the validity of the point that the book itself made earlier, that technology is neither good nor bad, right? The book said that, and that's correct. Technology just is. You may remember that quote by Jacob Bronowski that we put up on the board about how to argue with technology is like arguing with man's upright gait and his facility for speech and capacity for thought. Technology just is. It's not good nor bad. And so it's interesting to me when I read later in the book, and they have chapters on military technologies, you read quotes like this, where the author contradicts something that he said earlier, right? Rudy Volte's a smart guy, but you should always pay attention to what people say and how they say it. Everybody, right? Because everybody's got a perspective, everybody's got an agenda of sorts. So here's what he says: war represents the dark side of technological advance. That sounds almost like he's saying it's a bad technology in some ways. He goes on, 2 pages later. For most of human existence, the baser instincts of humanity were checked by the limitations of the weapons that could be used. I don't agree with that. I don't know what you think about it, but I don't think the baser instincts of humanity are checked at all. They may be limited. I mean, obviously with limited technology, you can do less damage to groups of people using an axe than you can with a nuclear weapon or something. But that instinct is no different. The tools change. The technologies, the tools, they're different over time. They evolve, they adapt. But that instinct, which he's talking about here, and he's saying it's a baser instinct, that's the same. It's the idea of using coercive violence, whether you're using an axe or a nuclear weapon, that he's referencing. The technology has nothing to do with that instinct. It just has to do with how that instinct is carried out. 287, warfare presents the dark side of technological progress. Although technological advances have bettered many aspects of human life, they've also led to a terrifying expansion in the ability to kill and destroy. Well, they have gotten far better in terms of killing and destruction, much more efficient, obviously. We have cruise missiles and all sorts of things today that people in the ancient world could not even have dreamed of or foreseen. But it's interesting to me that Volte is taking an argument which he himself made effectively earlier in the book, that technology is neither good nor bad. And when he talks about this topic, he then changes gears. He basically then just goes back on what he's told you earlier. And I want to point this out to you because I think if you read a lot of books on technology, or you read much or pay attention much to military technology especially, you will see that there's this undercurrent among people who write books like this, people who are academics. Most of them are extremely uncomfortable with military technology and talking about it. It's sort of an unpleasant thing for them, and so they want to ignore it, and they want to just sort of put it in a corner and say this is dark technology or something. It's something unpleasant, we don't want to talk about it. It's really kind of weird to me, because once you understand that war is basically the great human universal, it crosses culture, it crosses time, it is the universal experience of humanity. It's the one thing that all cultures are involved in without exception. Then understanding the technology with that human universal activity should be pretty important. And I think it doesn't really work valuably to just say, let's the dark side, let's just not talk about it. I'm actually working on a book right now to sort of deal with this a little bit. We'll see if it comes out in some years in the future. Why has war been such a consistent driver of technology? Picture's worth 1,000 words. If you're this guy, if you're a Greek hoplite and you're in the front rank of a phalanx, you better hope that the technology that you have, this bronze hoplon shield, the bronze Corinthian helm, you had better hope that that holds good. Because if your technology fails, it's your life on the line, right? People, societies, nations, empires have poured extraordinary efforts and sums of the best minds that they have available to trying to develop the most advanced military technology of the time, because the consequences for not doing so are really immediate. It's not exaggerating to say nations have risen and empires have fallen because of this issue of military technology. It's that important. So when we talk about weapons, when we think about weapons, it seems to me that there are two ways that you can consider these things. One way is the Rudy Volte way, in your textbook, the way of most academics, where you say it's a dark technology, it's scary, something we don't want to talk about, we'd rather ignore it, rather pretend it didn't exist. Or you can adopt the approach that I think is more useful, the one that I'm doing in the book I'm working on now, in which you think about weapons and their development, you consider them not to be dark technology, but you say, no, instead they're dual-use tools. They're dual-use tools. They're just technology. They're inanimate objects. They're a tool for a specific task or purpose. And they have a dual use. From the very beginning, they have a dual use. And so some people may look at this and they say, well, what's the dual use? Well, offensive and defensive, you could say that. I mean, while it's easy to say that something like the firearm, a gun, there's many people say, well, those are bad, right? Bad technology. We wish it had never been invented. Guns can be used for great evil. In the hands of somebody like the SS Einsatzgruppen Death Squad, machine gunning civilians, yeah, that's horrific, horrible, evil, right? But in the hands of American GIs or Marines liberating Europe or the Pacific, those guns are doing something positive. Offense, defense, dual use. You go all the way back into the past, and you say, okay, the first weapons, they're dual use tools, they're offensive and defensive. They allow for protection, whether it's offensive or defensive, but they also allow for food provision. And some of these are images you saw much earlier in the course, right? If you put yourself way back into human history and you say, humanity does not have claws and fangs. We're not naturally gifted with these types of protective mechanisms. When we go up against something like a cave bear way, way back in the human past, or we're trying to chase down and kill our next meal, you have to have implements, technology, tools to be able to do that. And it just makes sense. Nobody's going to argue that. Who in the world wants to go up against a cave bear with their fists? Not many people, right? You're going to do anything you can. You're going to want, not even the Mexican wrestlers. No.
I was thinking maybe I would.
Oh, wow.
You know how tall a big bear is?
Braver man than me.
12 feet.
Imagine if I did that though and I knocked out a bear with one punch.
You would become legend. Yeah, if you could do that, right?
Yeah.
But most of these folks, they're going to use tools to do it because it enhances your survival, right? So what I'm saying with dual-use tools, what I'm saying is that these technologies had a variety of uses. They weren't all to kill people with. Yes, sometimes a spear could be used to kill people, to defend your family group, your cave, your kill. Other times, your spear would be used to just hunt other animals, obtain the food you need. They're dual use, right? It doesn't really fit to just say, well, this is the birth of dark technology, and we need to shut up about it now. So man's first weapons. You may see this again on the quiz that we're going to take coming up quickly, probably next week. Man's first weapons. Man's first weapons arguably are his fists, right? I love this slide. I love this slide. I used to do some coaching of various mixed martial arts and stuff, and I love this slide because it's taken from the internet. Whoever's doing, what's the problem here? Yeah, thanks. Thanks. It's gonna break the thumb, right? Boom, broken thumb right there as soon as you hit somebody with that left. So people on the internet don't always give you good pictures of stuff, but I like this one because it sort of illustrates the point. First weapons are your fists. But those aren't super good. I mean, you hit somebody even with a good fist, you hit somebody in the face, you're going to do a lot of damage to them. You may very well kill them if you're able to do it long enough. But you're going to hurt your hand. I guarantee you're going to feel some pain from that. Your hand's not going to function very well for a while after doing that consistently. So there's an evolution going to take place here, right? I mean, people are inventive. It doesn't take long of battering your hands bloody against something or someone else where you say, well, what do we do? Well, arguably this is probably the first non-biologically inherent weapon that man uses. It's a rock. I mean, pretty simple. You pick it up, you throw it at somebody or something, or you hit it over the head with it. And so you're on this trajectory now towards dark technology if you listen to Volpe. So the first people, what they start to do, they've got rocks and they're using them as impact weapons. They're using them to cause blunt force trauma. But somebody gets a really bright idea and they say, you know, if we could take obsidian, volcanic glass, or flint, or another type of rock called chert, C-H-I-R-T, we could do this thing, napping, where we sit here, and we talked about this during the class, you chip away. You chip away, you flake away the edge, and you create a sharp blade out of rock. that would allow us to do several things. In the first place, once you're able to get an edge on a piece of rock that's sufficiently sharp, not only can you go to slashing and cutting and stabbing instead of just blunt force trauma, rock smashing, but you can use this dual use tool to create for yourself cordage out of something like thinner twigs and branches. You whittle them down and you create a type of rope out of it, cordage. Well, once you've got cordage, it allows you to take technology like this and lash it to a branch or a stick. So you've got the technology that you might call a knife emerging, ancient Stone Age, Paleolithic times. In that same era, they get the bright idea, you know, if you're going to fight the cave bear, this is better than your bare hands. I mean, for sure. You got like a 6-inch long stone blade. And for people who are looking at that and saying, that's so old technology. This is very sharp. You could shave with some of these things.
All bears have like 20 of those.
They have 20 of them, yeah. The bear has the advantage. Oh, and the bear, like you say, 12 feet tall, so he has reach, right?
Yeah.
He's going to swat you over and open you up with his 12 of those before you get close enough to use your 6-inch long rock blade. And 6 inches is about the length of these Paleolithic blades because the rock structure itself cannot be stable. It doesn't hold together if you go longer than about 6 inches on one of these things. So your engagement range is a great point. The bear has 12 of those things. I like that. But in addition to that, your engagement range is like 6 inches. It's bad breath range, right? You got to get close enough to that bear to make use of that thing. So it's a natural evolution to say, we're going to take a stick, 10 feet long, 8 feet long, we're going to tie this thing to the end of it using cordage, and that suddenly gives us greater standoff distance. It's kind of interesting when you think of it this way, because you know in modern weapons we talk a lot about standoff distance. How far back can we be and still hit that target and cause damage on it? That's what this process is. This is the beginning of that, trying to create standoff range or standoff distance. So the reason that the spear came about was to create standoff range, to give you a little bit of breathing room between yourself and whatever is in a fight to the death with you, whether that's a person or whether that's an animal. And so these spears are actually featured really heavily in Paleolithic cave era art. And you can see, if you were to look at these sorts of images, that you've got figures of people, they're carrying spears. And in some of these pictures, they're hunting animals with them. They're chasing after reindeer with them and things. And in others, they're using exactly the same technology to fight and kill each other, right? People who are anthropologists will tell you that in the late Paleolithic, there's extraordinary evidence, just tremendous amounts of it, for the fact that Paleolithic era man fought and killed other Paleolithic era men in highly organized ways. Ambushes, raids, things like that. This is not just sort of thrown together ad hoc. There's actually a planning process that takes place here. If any of you believe that, you know, back in man's past it was inherently peaceful and man wasn't warlike, I've got some books you could read. One of them's a friend of mine who teaches, he's the head of the anthropology department at Harvard now. He wrote a book called First Battles in which he describes this. He says, no, if you go back into man's prehistory, you see that man was every bit as violent as he ever was. There is no period of the noble savage, as many people will often refer to it. So you're in a time when rocks are kind of the height of technology, and what they're trying to do is gain greater and greater range. Now, a spear can only get you so much standoff distance. I mean, you can find a stick that's like 25 feet long and stick a knife on the end of it, but it's not going to be very stable, and it's not going to be manageable. So it's not going to be the spear that is the answer to getting you greater standoff range. The first real standoff weapon beyond the spear is the sling. The sling's a really simple piece of technology. What you do with this is you just have your cordage, rope in effect, you have a leather patch, and you find the smoothest stones you can. And you'll hold on to this end, you'll loop your thumb through that loop, and you'll twirl this thing round and round until you develop sufficient speed. You develop sufficient speed with that weighted rock that as soon as you let go the open end, The little leather pouch flies open, and the rock slings out going forward. And this, people look at it and they'll confuse it. They'll use confused terminology here, and they'll say things like, well, that's sort of like a slingshot. It's nothing like a slingshot. A slingshot is basically a toy that you give an 8 or 10-year-old, and you say, don't hurt yourself with this, and you watch them because they're going to hurt themselves with it. This is a military weapon. This is something that you can kill large animals with. It's something that you can kill substantial individuals with. All sorts of accounts from the ancient world of this, right? Some of you probably heard King David and Goliath. David and Goliath, using a sling, right? He's able to find a weak spot in the armor, in that case, Bronze Age. Sling's still effective. There are people in the ancient world from the islands in the Mediterranean called the Balearic Islands. And these Balearic Island slingers are so good at this type of warfare that even as late as Roman times, the Roman Empire hires these people as mercenaries. It says, hey, you're going to be the ranged fire guys for the Roman legions. This sling stuff still works. So they're pursuing greater and greater range. So they've got the sling. It's not too much of a jump to say you take a wooden stick, you tie some cordage to it, you pull a short spear with a little fletching on it, and you have a bow and arrow. Now these first things are just simple bows, what they're called. A simple bow is just a stick, which is bent, and it's tied with some cordage under tension. It has these first bows. They've got a draw weight of maybe 30 pounds. Draw weight refers to how much force it takes to grab that arrow and draw it back to full extension of the arrow. So because these first bows, the ones that they found, anthropologists, are fairly short, and they're simple bows, they have a low draw weight, just about 30 pounds. If you've not done anything with archery, that's the equivalent of picking up a 30-pound dumbbell off the floor and drawing it up. Not that heavy, right? But it means that the arrow that you launch off of one of these simple bows doesn't go very far, and it doesn't hit super hard. So these early simple bows are kind of limited to hunting small game. They're dual-use tools. They start off as like the .22 long rifle of the prehistoric world. You can kill rabbits with these early bows. You can do stuff like that. But you're not going to really shoot larger animals. You're not going to shoot people with something like this very often because it wouldn't have much effect. But what starts to happen, because man is inventive and he's always seeking for greater technology, the simple bow is going to be improved upon. They're going to start working with a process of lamination. They're going to end up developing something called the recurve bow, which makes use of horn and sinew, which they glue together with the wood. It gives a great deal more strength to the bow itself, and it's going to increase that draw weight. By the time of the ancient Greeks, you're talking about bows with a draw weight of between 60 to 80 pounds, which is enough to start shooting deer and people with pretty high degree of efficiency. And for people who say, well, this would have been a primitive weapon, certainly it's primitive, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. If you look at these ancient Paleolithic arrowheads, they've still got that edge that's snapped on them. They're razor sharp. If somebody had practiced with something like this sufficiently, there's absolutely no reason as you get into the ancient world that this type of weapon was not absolutely deadly. Metallurgical revolution changes everything. We talked about this earlier in the course, but we talked about it with reference to farming and things. The metallurgical revolution, which leads to something we call the Bronze Age, changes everything. Why? Because all of a sudden, you have the ability not to just work in rock anymore. You're not just going to sit there and flake away at a rock edge and make it sharp. Now you have the ability to cast molten bronze weapons, axe heads, swords, spears. But it goes beyond just offensive tools like swords that you see here. It includes things like body armor. You're not going to make body armor out of rocks. That's just not going to happen. It's not possible with the technology they have. So in the Bronze Age, you have the world's first body armor, response to the weapon, right? You get this arms race beginning to develop between weapon makers and people who make armor. And so because you have this new technology, the bronze sword, it's absolutely devastating as a weapon. If you cut against somebody, you can cut a limb off, arms, legs, happens fairly frequently in the Bronze Age. And so there's a reaction to that. The technology has become more deadly, And so they looked at technology to provide a solution. You have helmets, you have cuirasses or breastplates made of bronze. You have bronze shields and bronze greaves, which are leg coverings. And these things are all made for the individual. I mean, it's not something you just order off the shelf or something. This is individually sized to the wearer. So we've got these increasing specializations that are occurring as a result of the Bronze Age. This is sort of a review of some of those early lectures. We've got the agricultural revolution, which means more food is available. We have the specialization of labor, which results in things like the invention of the wheel. And we've got the domestication of animals. And the reason that these three features are so important to what happens with military technology is that suddenly, for the first time in human history, settled, stable life is possible in towns and cities. And it's out of these towns and cities that we're going to see this metallurgical revolution really continue, and we're going to see the rise of the first armies. Up to this point, people, when they had gone to war, you might think of it as being like a raid. You go into somebody else's hunting grounds, and you try to kill or capture some of their tribal members. You maybe try to carry off some of their goods. But it's really with the rise of the city and these city-states in Mesopotamia that we start to see something that modern man would recognize and say, yes, that is war. It is a formal activity which is carried out by a political entity of the nation state with all of the resources that these kings can muster. And so they develop a really specialized style of fighting. It's in ancient Samaria and Mesopotamia that they come up with this thing. And there are some people who say that this is the important technology of the Bronze Age. The early Bronze Age has this important technology of the war cart. And what is it really? It is a battlefield taxi. It is not a chariot. It's not fast at all. It has these 4 small wooden wheels. It's being pulled by a team of 4 donkeys. And this thing's job is to trundle up to the battle line with a king or a noble or somebody really important who has enough money to have bronze armor and a bronze sword. Many of the commoners are still equipped with rock spear points and things. When this noble reaches the front lines, he hops off of his battle taxi and he waddles forward into battle, like a human tank almost, and he's going to square off with another king or noble on the other side, and they fight one-on-one. It's kind of a duel type thing. Duel being fought between noble and king. What happens is one of them wins, one loses. If the loser's lucky, he's able to get back to his war cart and trundle off the field. If he's not, he's killed in the area between these lines. So battlefield mobility has started to become kind of a thing. And that issue of moving on the battlefield becomes really critical. And we see in ancient Egypt, beginning about 2000 BC, the emergence of a war chariot. The Egyptians are the first people to really perfect the technology of the chariot. They take that idea of the war cart from Sumeria, slow, trundling, not all that capable, and they say, let's soup this up. Instead of having it made of these clunky, solid wooden wheels, they create these thin, light, highly maneuverable spoked wheels. The Egyptian chariots are made of wicker. It's the same thing your laundry hampers are made of in your mom's house. It's the same material, wicker. They just weave the base plate for this. They weave the walls out of wicker. And so the Egyptian chariots, including the horse pole, which is this wooden implement going forward connecting the horses to this thing, the whole Egyptian chariot, the examples that they pulled out of tombs from ancient Egypt, most of these chariots, they weigh less than 80 pounds. They're very light. One man who's strong enough can easily lift this thing in the air and move it. So if you attach a 2-horsepower engine to the front of it, and you've got this really light 2-wheeled vehicle, you can move really quickly. If this sort of thing is of interest to you, there is a special on Nova, on PBS, it's on YouTube, you can watch the whole thing for free, about archaeologists who build one of these chariots, according to the examples they pulled out in ancient Egypt, and they test it. And they find that, this type of technology, you can get up to about 30 or 35 miles an hour for a fairly short period of time. It allows you pretty substantial mobility, provided the ground is flat, like most of Egypt is. And so the way the Egyptians use this technology to fight is that they have a driver, they'll steer the team of horses, And then you have an archer who's standing behind the driver on this platform. And the way they fight has effectively been described as the drive-by of the ancient world. You go sweeping by the enemy army at about 30 or 35 miles an hour. You don't have windows to roll down to get in the way. But you just fire arrows as fast as you can from your mobile archery platform, which is really what the chariot has its advantage in being. Now, the chariot technology reaches its apex, its peak, in the ancient kingdom of Assyria. The Assyrians are a really warlike people. They develop a lot of technologies, but the one they're most famous for is the chariot. And some differences here in Egypt. Egypt came up with this light, highly maneuverable thing that you could sort of stay on the fringes of the action with and pepper your enemy with arrows and hopefully kill them. The Assyrians take that same idea and they up-armor it. They build iron chariots with iron-shod wheels, and they have to increase the number of horses to pull it because it's greater weight. They have more men in the back than Egypt had in their chariots, and so they basically created a super weapon here of the ancient world. Now, while Egyptian chariots are mobile archery platforms, these Assyrian ones are shock weapons, which means that the Assyrian chariot is heavy enough and substantial enough that you can charge it directly into an enemy battle line, and you're going to crush people under as you go by. It's not really light and flimsy like that Egyptian chariot was. The Assyrians are also the first people, if anybody's wondering, to establish the scythed wheel chariots, in which they attach blades to the wheels, so that as they go crashing into an enemy battle line, it'll cut enemy soldiers off at the knees and things. Pretty unpleasant. Some examples of the technologies that they do develop. The Assyrians focus on chariots, but they also recognize that they're not always going to be able to use their chariots to defeat their enemies. There are times when the enemy is so afraid of the Assyrian chariot force that the enemy is going to retreat into a city behind the walls. And so if you are an enemy of the Assyrians and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to fight the Assyrian chariots, that's pretty frightening. I'm going to go behind the walls and shut the gates. I'll be safe there. The Assyrians developed technology. They're the first people to do this, to develop siege technology, the ability to capture a city, a walled, fortified city, fairly efficiently. The Assyrians developed the world's first battering rams, which is a device or an implement using a weighted log on wheels to slam it repeatedly into a gate and break the gate down. The Assyrians developed the world's first siege machines, like towers. This is an example of a wheeled tower. The Assyrians will wheel it up to a wall of a city, and then they have a ladder inside and a little gate, a little drawbridge, that they'll lower onto a shattered part of the enemy wall, and they'll charge across that into the city and take the city. The Assyrians also have a technique where if a city's holding out against them, they'll tunnel under the wall. They'll use these wooden support beams to shore up the tunnel. And as they build the tunnel under the length of the wall, they smear those wooden beams with pitch, tar, and they'll set them alight. And as those wooden beams burn away, the weight of the wall and the ground above causes everything to collapse. It opens up a hole in the city's defenses, and then the Assyrian army will come in with its chariots and finish the battle. Most people don't ever get to that stage with the Assyrians, though, because these people are really brutal. They do things typically like impaling people and building pyramids of severed heads in front of the gates of cities that resist them. They're really not nice folks. So we've talked about chariot technology and how it starts in Egypt. It's really a derivation of that war cart from Sumeria. The Assyrians perfect it to its pinnacle. And so it leads to a really interesting question. You know, you have the super weapon of the day, say 800 BC. The super weapon of the day is the chariot. Why doesn't everybody adopt that? Why doesn't everybody say, all right, this is the way, it's the technological way that things are done. Why doesn't everybody adopt it? It's cultural. It's cultural, right? You've got regions of the world like Greece. That's where we're turning to next. If you look at this picture of Greece, you'll understand why they don't adopt the chariot. I mean, they're a peninsula surrounded by the ocean. Maritime things are pretty important there. But even if you're fighting on land, you're talking about massive mountains and hills, and you're not going to be able to traverse that in a chariot. You can't move from point A to point B here. And so the answer for fighting wars in a place like Greece, which is very mountainous and rugged and rocky, is not the chariot. It doesn't work here. And so the Greeks are going to have to adopt a new style of fighting. They make a virtue of necessity, and they do what we might call the first infantry revolution. The Greeks basically say, our countryside is too rugged to use chariots. We're going to have to use foot soldiers. So let's make the best that technology can allow them to be. And 800 to about 300 BC, that's this. It's a Greek hoplite. The word hoplite, named for this type of Greek infantry soldier, comes from his shield, the bronze hoplon. It's about a yard in diameter. It's an oak shield. It's got a front or a facing of bronze. These hoplites are also notable for these Corinthian helmets that shield the nose and the sides of the face. They're really kind of interesting if you think about what it would have been like wearing something like that piece of equipment. If any of you are interested, I'll bring in a modern copy I have of one of you try it on. And one of the things you'll see immediately is it really restricts your field of vision. It restricts your ability to hear well at all. I mean, your head's encased in metal. And if you were to imagine this limited field of view, limited hearing, and you're fighting shoulder to shoulder with a few hundred other guys just like you in these tightly packed military formations called phalanxes. The way phalanxes of hoplites fight each other in Greece is they square off on a field and they approach to within spear range. They don't throw their spears. These are primarily thrusting weapons for the Greeks. And it's basically like a rugby scrum between each phalanx, pushing, shoving. Spears and swords would be involved. But if you were to slip or trip in that phalanx, you're in the front rank, people are shoving you from behind, and you're fighting people right in front of you. If you were to slip and fall and go down, you're probably not going to get back up. Because somebody behind you is going to immediately step forward and take your place. You're going to probably get trampled. And even if you're not trampled, these Greek spears, you'll note they have a sharp spear point here, but even the butt end of the spear has a sharp cap on it. And the reason for that is as you are stepping over a wounded enemy in the phalanx fighting, you take that, you punch it down and finish off enemy wounded that way. So these hoplites, they fight in this thing called a phalanx, super tight packed formation. And this is really an important feature, not just for military things. I'm going to take you a little bit bigger here. I'm not just going to talk military technology, I'm going to relate this to a few important other things. These hoplites fighting in the phalanx, they are being produced by a culture that centers around something called the polis, which is a Greek city-state. The Greek polis is a very compact, intimate city. They all live very close together, they've grown up together, and the men of the city-state fight in the city-state's phalanx in times of war. This is an important detail, an important series of details, because ancient Greece is often called the birthplace of democracy. There is this really inherent connection between military service in the polis, Greek city-state, and having a political say or a political voice, a political vote. Why am I making a deal of this? Because it's arguable that without this military technology of the hoplite, without the doctrine of fighting war in phalanx formations, democracy does not come to birth in the way that it did. The fact that you have people as equals, rich, poor, from the city-state, standing shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx. It makes it very difficult for people to then say to someone who is given military service and risk their life just like everybody else, no, you don't get a say in what we do here. This way of fighting does lead to the creation of democracy as it exists. I want to also briefly mention something called the Western way of war. The Western way of war has to do with the way hoplites approach fighting. The Western way of war has been defined as seeking to fight wars through decisive battles, which are short and sharp. What we mean by that is this. These Greek hoplites are citizen soldiers, mostly, with the exception of Sparta. The Greek polis produces citizen soldiers. It means that these guys, these Greek hoplites, they have a job back home. In times of war, they put on their Corinthian helmet and they take their shield and they march out with the phalanx and do their thing. And when the battle's over, they want to go back home to do their day job, take care of their business and their families. So what this means is that in ancient Greece, these hoplites, when there's something that they're gonna fight over, they can't be on campaign for month after month. They wanna go out and resolve whatever the issue is in one blood-soaked afternoon with the opposing phalanx. The winner takes all, and everybody gets to go home who survives, right? They're not gonna be on extended campaign. Well, why is this an important detail, this Western way of war, fighting battles which are short, sharp, and decisive? Because it actually gives the Greeks a mental edge over any potential opponent. Most of you probably seen that movie 300, and you probably remember the scene where the Persians, this massive empire, they send some diplomats. I mean, the movie's not that great a film historically, but they do get this detail right. The Persians send these diplomats to talk to the Greeks, to try to negotiate a peace. You get that famous line, "This is Sparta," and he kicks him in the hole. You probably remember that. Yeah, I can tell you remember, the people laughing. Yeah, I remember that. So what? So these Greeks are not interested in sort of negotiating it. When they fight, they are fighting for keeps. They want to go out in the course of one afternoon and finish the combat, get it over with, get it done with. So the Greeks actually build a world empire. Under Alexander the Great, the Greeks and Macedonians, they build a world empire. They're not going to last very long. They're not going to last long. Beginning in the 300s BC, a small Italian city-state known as Rome begins to rise. Rome is going to rise purely through military force, through military technology. So how is Rome going to defeat the Greek phalanx? How do you out-hoplite the Greek hoplites? I mean, they invented this style of doing things. How are you going to make that one better? And the way the Romans are going to do this is by changing the rules of the game somewhat. The Romans look at the Greek hoplite phalanx and they say, what's the weakness? What is the weakness of this? How do you beat that? Well, one of the things that you can do is to fight it on rough, uneven ground. If you fight in a ground that's really hilly and the phalanx has trouble maintaining cohesion, you got these guys marching lockstep, pressed in really tight together, they've got a problem if they're on really rough ground. So the Romans look at this and say, we're never going to be able to beat the Greeks hoplite against hoplite. We would lose that. The Greeks perfected this. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to develop a new type of soldier with new types of technology that will give us the edge, will change the rules. And so the Romans developed what's called the legion system. The legion system. There's a Roman military officer called Marius around the year 100 BC. He carries out some reforms of the Roman army, and he develops this legion system. So what is the difference here? Like, what's significant? Well, the Roman legion system is built around infantry soldiers who have large shields. The Romans call these shields scutum, if you care about that level of detail. But the Roman legionnaires themselves carry short throwing spears, javelins, which the Romans call the pilum, P-I-L-U-M, the Roman pilum. These Greek hoplites have a long spear that they hold on to, maybe 10, 12 feet long. The Romans have a pilum, a thrown javelin. And what are some things you can see about these pilum, these Roman javelins? Well, if you were to look at this, this tells you almost everything you need to know in one slide. This thing is designed to be thrown. It's a projectile weapon. If you're a Roman legionnaire, you've got a range with this thing of approximately 30 to 40 yards if you're really good. If you practiced a lot, you can throw that thing about 30 to 40 yards, which means you can outrange the spears of a hoplite. Each Roman legionary carries two pilum, two of these javelins. And here's how the Roman system works. You're a Roman soldier. You're fighting a Greek hoplite phalanx. They're marching towards you. At about 40 yards, you throw your first pilum. This spear has a barbed head and a long, narrow metal shaft. Now, when it strikes a Greek hoplite's shield, that hoplon, the Greek soldier has a choice. He takes the spear through the chest, bad option, or he blocks it with the shield. If he blocks with the shield, this spear point, it's going to get lodged or wedged in that Greek hoplite shield. He can't pull it out. It's got this barbed head on it. And on impact, this long, narrow metal shaft at the tip of this thing, it warps, it bends and twists. So that Greek hoplite, his shield has become unmanageable. He either takes the thing through the chest or he has an unmanageable shield. It's all tangled up with this thing, wedged in it. So what most Greek hoplites will do is throw their shield down and continue to advance. Well, the Roman soldier, the legionnaire, has one more pylon left. One more volley is going to drop some people. But the point is, even the survivors who actually reach Roman lines and get to close quarters, they're fighting without a shield against a Roman legionnaire who still has his, and he has this short stabbing sword called a gladius. Advantage Roman. So the Romans use this system to great effect. They carve out a world empire using the system I've just told you about. It works equally well against Greeks, against Germanic barbarians, against wild Gauls, against the Carthaginians. This works very, very well indeed. The Romans put a lot of emphasis into military technology. They developed the world's first very far-range weapons, things like the ballista. It's basically a giant crossbow. It's capable of firing an iron spear or bolt for about 350 to 400 meters. There are examples of these ballistas being used when Julius Caesar is besieging a town of Elysium in Gaul. He's besieging this city, and some of the Gauls try to break out. And at a range of about 200 meters, these Roman ballistas open up. And according to the accounts in Caesar's Gallic Wars, you've got ballista bolts, which are capable of like punching through 4 or 5 people before they come to rest in somebody. And that's a devastating weapon for the ancient world. So this infantry thing has been done about to death. The Greeks had their phalanx, the Romans had their legion. As the Roman Empire crumbles internally, because they deficit spent themselves into oblivion, one of the reasons, you have this collapse of the Roman state. But you have this idea of fighting war using an infantry shield wall living on into what a lot of people know as the Dark Ages. Groups of people we could talk about being the Norse, the Vikings, they excel at this. I mean, what you're really seeing here is just an evolution of a fighting style that goes back to ancient Greece. You have guys on foot with a lot of armor who interlock their shields and they march forward together in step. And they collide with each other and try to hack their way through the opposing infantry formation. A few weapons that the Norse, the Vikings, come up with that are worth mentioning. Technologies that they develop. They make use of a weapon called the Danish axe, D-A-N-I-S-H, the Danish axe. This is basically a large, broad-headed axe that is on a haft about 6 feet tall. Here's a picture of one of them. You can see it's about the height of a man. An image of a reenactor doing something on the History Channel. Pretty large axe. Now these Norse or Viking sagas talk about these Danish axes pretty extensively. And they say that it was not unheard of for a Viking warrior in a shield wall to be able to take this axe and cleave the head off of his opponent's horse with one strike. And this thing's pretty devastating as a weapon. Things like the sword. The Norse really developed the sword into a fully functional military weapon. I mean, the Roman gladius was good at what it was. It was a short stabbing sword. But the Norse developed sword making into an incredible art. If any of you are interested in this sort of thing, there's another Nova special on YouTube called The Norse Sword. And there's modern metallurgists, people who make metal things for a living using modern techniques, who looking at the old pattern-welded Norse swords will say, we don't know today how they did this, how they had this level of technological acumen where they were able to build this type of technology that lasted for a millennia. And they dig it up and it's still functional, basically. How are they able to do that? Incredible skill in terms of weapons and armor. Incredible effort and brilliance put into the design of this stuff. I don't think most modern people realize how much effort and money and time and genius and thought went into designing technologies like this across human history and then employing them in the most efficient way possible. This is an example of Norse armor. Some people would say it's chainmail, but chainmail is a false term. It's actually just called mail. It's not chain at all. It's riveted links that you blend together in a garment like a giant oversized shirt, and it protects you against the cutting slashes of a blade. Now, what it doesn't do so well is protect you against direct thrusts or stabs, which can get through that link and actually cause some deep penetrating trauma. The Norse also developed things like the helmets that you see here, a nasal helmet, or a spangle helm as it's usually called. It's got this signature device for protecting the nasal bridge, which tends to be a major target with people hacking with swords. But they expand on it, and to try to have this full face protection, the Norse shields. I mean, people often don't think of that. They say, well, how boring. It's this sort of circular wooden thing. But if you look at it, think about the thought that goes into the creation of something like a shield like this. I mean, it's a yard of oak. It's usually glued together with various animal glues. It's held together that way. In the center, you have this device. It's called a boss, a shield boss. It's a hollowed out cup. And on the back side, it's hollowed out to allow the warrior to grip the wooden rod that runs across the shield. Gives him space for his knuckles inside that cup so that he's able to hold it. The edge of the shield is riveted with this metal band. And that's for two reasons. Because a shield like this is designed to take some pretty serious abuse, people swinging and hacking at it with axes and swords and things. You want it not to splinter apart, so you protect the edges and you hope to hold it together more efficiently. The second reason for this metal edge is that the shield is not just a defensive weapon. It's an offensive weapon as well. And somebody who really knows what they're doing with a shield. I've seen this in HEMA competitions. I've done that for years. If you want to know what that is, I'll chat with you later. But I've seen people in competitions do this in the modern world. They'll take their shield and sword as they're practicing and fighting, and they'll use this metal edge to hammer at people. They'll throw it like it's a punch. And if you weren't wearing a really good mask and helmet, you'd lose teeth and you'd have broken bones and things from it. You can really use the shield as an offensive tool as well. People who are interested in forensics might be interested in this. Everybody else will be like, how gross. If you look at Dark Age battles and the impact that these weapons had on people, and I'm not talking about societies of people, I'm talking about individuals now. Massive impact, right? If you look at Dark Age battles, what usually happened is that the losers had fled, the ones that were alive, and the winners just took all the bodies and threw them in a giant hole in the ground and covered it up. And so archaeologists and historians, when they find these places, not only do they find all sorts of swords and spear points and all kinds of things, but they find lots of bodies as well. And so they have forensics folks who will look at this and say, okay, what would this technology do, like to actual people? So this one is in a museum in Denmark. There was a battle between two Viking groups there. Yeah. Two Viking groups fighting for supremacy. All right. What you're seeing here is the top of somebody's cranium that got cut off. I mean, this person was presumably wearing a full metal helmet, and the cut of a sword, one of these Viking age pattern welded swords, sufficient to take the top of the head clean off. In this one, you may not be able to see it as well. This is a femur. It's the large bone in the leg, and the arrow pointing right here to this damage is on the back part of the femur. People will ask, well, what's the significance of that? What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that more than likely, the individual whose leg bone that was, back in the 900s AD, was in a shield wall, and there was fighting going on, and somebody opposite him took the sword in their right hand, presumably, because most people are right-handed, would have thrust in with it and performed what's called a draw cut. Thrust in with it and pulled that blade back across the back of this individual's leg. And you can see the chip mark on the bone as a result of it. Absolutely devastating, right? I mean, you kind of can get a sense in some ways. I mean, I'm sympathetic slightly to somebody like Volpe saying this is dark technology, right? It definitely has caused a lot of injury and suffering and death. But I'll suggest to you still that the technology is not what's causing it. The technology is just the tool, right? As we reach the late dark ages, as they're often called, I want to talk about a shift in technology, and this is basically almost the last thing we'll have time to cover today. Shift in technology, new technologies being invented. Most of you will be like, duh, but this is a pretty big moment in human history. The invention of this thing, the stirrup. Invention of the stirrup. The invention of a device which you attach to a saddle or a seat you throw on the back of a horse, allows you to maintain your balance while riding a horse, even if your horse impacts with an opponent. So up to this time in history, lots of people had ridden horses in war, but they didn't have stirrups. And so what this meant is that for most of human history, the horse and the cavalryman fought like this, with a bow on horseback. He stayed at distance from his enemy. But the creation of the stirrup allows for a heavily armored man carrying a long spear, which we might call a lance, to be able to sit on top of a horse and fight it out that way. He's a medieval knight. And so if you think about the stirrup and the rise of the medieval knight, this painting is from a battle of Hastings in 1066. You see sort of two fighting styles contrasted here. You see the Norman mounted cavalry, the knights, charging up Senlac Hill to fight the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. They're fighting for control of who will be king of England. Hastings in 1066. What advantages does it offer you to be on a horse?
But it gives you an unofficial height advantage.
Oh, it's more than unofficial.
Or maybe official, actually.
Official, yeah. Gives you a height advantage for
Yeah,
sure.
because think about it, people can't reach you, they'll be like,
Well, let's hold on the reaching you thing for a minute. It gives you a height advantage. What else?
You can just smash with the shield line.
Yeah, you go charging in there. It's not just you and your 200 pounds or whatever. It is you and your 1,200-pound animal plowing in. Yeah, it gives you that. What else?
It's much faster than like being
Super.
attached to a
Yeah.
chariot.
Yeah, no, you're way faster. You're on a horse. You can go cross country if you're a good rider at 30, 35 miles an hour. No problem. You're gonna outrun anybody.
You want more supplies?
You can haul more supplies, absolutely. If you look at this and you say, all right, you got this guy, his horse is rearing up. When he brings that mace down on this guy standing here, it's not just his arm strength and it's not just his body weight, it's the whole horse weight coming down. Massively devastating weapon, potentially. So what are some disadvantages though? I mean, a lot of this stuff cuts both ways, right? He's got a height advantage. That's an advantage in some ways. It's a disadvantage too.
You're a bigger target.
You're a bigger target, right? Not only you, but your horse. And if this guy here is smart enough, he's not going to try to just stab the rider. He's just going to stab the horse, bring the whole horse down. That's one way to do it. Other disadvantages. The horse, yeah,
If your horse does go down, it's gonna end up crushing you.
it's going to crush you too. How many people in here have like ridden horses extensively? Anybody? I say extensively, I mean like once a week. One person, okay. My wife, she's a teacher, but she also teaches riding lessons on the side. We have several horses at our house. I get to ride all the time. I'm not really a big fan of horse riding as a result. I will tell you that horses are beautiful animals. I can see the validity of using them in battle, but they are freaky scary sometimes too, over stupid stuff. You ride a horse for any moment of time, any length of time, and you will note that leaves blow across the ground, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, you're constantly dealing with this. I can't even imagine what this would be like. Trying to ride and control a horse while people are swinging things at you and all this yelling and everything. Wow. I actually did put on a suit of armor once that I owned. I was trying to ride one of my wife's horses to practice with my friends this theory of whether a horse would charge at people on foot holding spears out toward, they weren't actual spears, they were sticks, towards the horse. And the horse almost ended up depositing me in the mud, so I don't know, not a huge fan of horses in some way.
Maybe they may have bred them to be a little bit more brave, maybe.
I think so. I think these were probably bred, and I think they were trained for this. None of my wife's horses are.
Because I've noticed that too, that they can be
Yeah, they're a
They
little.
should have used more to begin with, because they're already nice.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you breed it and train it specifically, you might have a little different experience. But that's effective, though. If you want to see the closest thing to this in the modern world, just go on YouTube and type in police horse versus rioters. And you'll get all sorts of demonstrations from around the world where people are yelling and throwing bottles and things. and the police show up on horseback, and everybody scatters and runs. It's kind of interesting to watch.
Wasn't that the last cavalry charge against the Japanese in World War II though?
Yes, World War II was the
That was
last
the-
cavalry charge. We may get there, but not today. So as we're talking about medieval Europe, technology and this whole knight thing, it creates the society of the Middle Ages. It's a military technology that makes possible the feudal system. The feudal system, the idea that you have a man with a suit of armor and a horse and a sword, we would call him a knight. The fact that he's able to rule over a territory from his fortified house, which we would call a castle. This whole thing, centuries and centuries of social interactions under the feudal system are not possible without this military technology. Military technology doesn't just impact the battlefield. It has impacts far beyond it. You want to understand whole eras of human society and culture, you have to understand the technology, because without the technology, the era doesn't happen that way. It doesn't develop or happen that way. Even something like heraldry, the idea that you have this sort of colorful pattern on shields that are painted. Why is it you can go to Disney World and you go into the little store and they have your last name on a coffee mug with this coat of arms, and every American's like, oh, this is my family's coat of arms. We're Americans, it's not like it matters now. How does that develop? Why is it around? Well, it's around because in the Middle Ages, you've got these guys in really expensive suits of armor who you can't see who it is because they're behind all that metal, and they want the world to know, yes, I am the Earl of Leicester, and I'm carrying my little banner and my little painted shield to advertise to you that this is who I am. So about the year 1300, the cavalry dominance of the medieval knight was starting to grow old, and people were starting to say, maybe we can change the rules again. How do you fight off a medieval knight? Well, if you're not a knight yourself, you've got to develop technology to do it. And the answer comes to them in the 1300s in the form of a pike, a long spear. And I'm talking maybe 18 to 20 feet long. 18 to 20 foot long spear. You take these infantrymen, these spearmen, and you put them in these blocks. You give them all pikes, and they all hold them out and walk forward. And even a knight can't close with that. The Swiss were the first to do this. They develop a formation called the Schiltron. It's Schiltron. But the Scots do this also. The Scots get really good at this pike formation fighting. If any of you saw the movie Braveheart, you know that. You know that William Wallace in the movie says, oh, we've got to cut down, that's sort of the movie version of how that came about. Trying to counter the dominance of English mounted heavy cavalry or knights. You build really long spears to do it with. So you've got the pendulum swinging back as we start to close down the lecture in the Middle Ages. You've got the pendulum swinging back towards the infantry because of this whole pike square thing. But it's in England that they're going to develop the last piece of technology we're talking about today, and that is the medieval longbow, the longbow. Basically, the question is, how do you get greater range? The pike gives you 18 to 20 feet of standoff range, but if you want greater range than that, you're going to have to go with a projectile weapon. And it's going to be this English longbow that becomes the weapon of choice. Now, if anybody's familiar with the Robin Hood legend, you know a little bit about this and how it works. The English longbow is a 6-foot long bow. It's as tall as a man is. It's made of a wood called yew wood, Y-E-W. It's a very light, springy wood. And these English longbows have a draw weight of anywhere from 180 to 250 pounds. That's the equivalent of taking a 180 to 250 pound dumbbell on the floor and lifting it to your ear. That's the strength it takes to draw one of these things. Each bow shoots an arrow that is a yard long. So you get this phrase for it, the cloth yard shaft of the English archer in the Middle Ages. The English longbow itself fires arrows that have two types of arrowheads. Technology at work. They have a broadhead, which looks like this, and if you've done deer hunting knows what a broadhead does. The same thing in the Middle Ages. You use a broadhead arrow when you are shooting at a horse or at an unarmored man, a guy without armor. This will work really great. If you're shooting at a knight who's wearing all this expensive plate armor, you use this type of arrowhead. It's called a bodkin. Bodkin, a bodkin tipped arrow. It's basically the first armor penetrating projectile weapon that we've talked about in history.
What is it called?
The bodkin arrow, Bodkin. What is it really? It's a metal spike. It's a metal needle-like spike that you put on the end of an arrow, and you can punch holes through the plate armor of a knight at about 100 yards. The longbow's rate of fire is not going to be surpassed until the machine guns of the 20th century. An English longbowman on a medieval battlefield, if he was good at what he did, he could fire 12 arrows per minute. 12 arrows per minute from an English medieval longbowman. So if you look at a medieval battle like Agincourt, Crécy, or Poitiers, these large battlefields of the 100 Years' War where the English employed the longbow against the French, if you talk about a force of, say, 12,000 English archers, and let's say they're having a bad day, let's say they have 10 arrows per minute per archer. 12,000 times 10, what is that, 120,000? 120,000 arrows are in the air every single minute, dropping onto French lines. This is like a machine gun, in effect, it's ready to fire. So these bodkin arrows, they can penetrate right through chainmail, and they will punch holes even through plate armor at 100 yards or less. It's that really high draw weight, and that armor-piercing tip of the bodkin will get through it. Now, I mention this because when I was an undergraduate, I was in a class, and a professor was talking, and he mentioned this. He said chainmail, which is the wrong term, it's chain. It's mail, it's not chainmail. He said chainmail is nearly impervious to all attacks, especially arrows. And I remember thinking as an undergrad, I was like, this professor's saying that? But you've got these little holes and gaps here. Wouldn't a bodkin arrow go through it? So I was curious about it. And I've done this, a lot of people have done it. I own armor like this, and I own an English longbow, so I have the land to do it too. I went out and started practicing. Bodkins will go right through it. And the English armories, that's part of the British museum system, they were kind of curious about this sort of thing too. So they set up their own plate version, and you can see these holes punched through this plate armor. It just perforated it. It was done at 80 yards with a longbow with a draw weight of about 200 pounds. I don't have the same money as the English museum system, the Royal Armory, so I had to make do with this. But similar result. Armor is not proof against this. And so at these three battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, English bowmen cut down thousands of French knights. I mean, over and over and over again. You can't really see the slide here for Agincourt, but I'll tell you briefly what happened. I don't have long. The English set up a position at Agincourt at a place where the wood line was narrowing like a funnel. The English occupied the narrow end of the funnel. They drove wooden stakes into the ground in front of their position. And then they sent their archers out behind those stakes. And as the French army, which outnumbered them almost 20-1, showed up at the other end of the field, the English archers fired a few ranging shots, trying to warm their bows up. And the French decided, instead of planning out a better strategy, to just launch 3 massive human wave attacks of mounted knights into this narrowing funnel, fronted by sharpened wooden stakes and met by 120,000 arrows in the air every single minute. It's a disaster for the French. There was a chronicler who wrote this about it. I won't read you the whole thing, but William de Braus, a lord, he's a French knight. He was wounded by an arrow that penetrated his thigh, the casing armor on both sides, the part of his saddle known as the alva, and then it mortally wounded the horse. That's some pretty substantial firepower for the 1400s. Another knight was pinned to his saddle by an arrow through his hip and the covering armor. And when he turned his horse around, he got another arrow in his other hip that fixed him in his saddle on both sides. It goes on. It talks about no sooner were we engaged and the English archers began to shoot murderously from both flanks, knocking down horses and piercing everything before them with their long barbed arrows. He's talking about the bodkin points. So as we close out, a really good question. The French do this 3 times at battles separated by decades. Why did the French never learn? It'd be easy if it were that simple, right? But what it speaks to is the power of social assumption. The fact that these French knights were like, we're noblemen, we're knights. We have swords and castles. These English bowmen that we're facing, they're commoners. They're just like peasants. We'll ride them down, no problem. And so they would have done if those had been French peasants. But these are English peasants. They're equipped with a military technology of the longbow that allows even a commoner